Thank you. Good evening. My name is Michael Luna, and I'm presenting to your group today on the Cosmic Conundrum, Fermi's Paradox, and the search for advanced intelligent life in the universe. So just a little bit about me. I'm an astronautical engineer working with NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena. Currently, I'm a guidance and control engineer working on the Europa Clipper project, which is going to fly past Jupiter's moon, Europa, sometime within the next decade, searching the moon for potential signs of life. I am here representing myself today. So I've been interested in astronomy pretty much since middle school. The space bug pretty much hit me but the space bug pretty much hit me then in high school when I entered a history contest, and my subject was the US human spaceflight program. And once I learned about that, I was hooked. So that inspired me to pursue my education in aerospace engineering at UCLA. Got a bachelor's there, and then master's in aerospace engineering with a specialty in astronautics at USC. And then later on, I completed an astronautical engineering degree, PhD from USC, just about 3 years ago, completed it. So the purpose, the point of this article, as I mentioned, is the Cosmic Conundrum. This article appeared in the Griffith Observer's August magazine after winning the first prize in the seventh annual Joan and Arnold Seidel Science Writing Contest. I've been entering this contest since about 1997, pretty much out of high school. And so I've had a few articles appear in the past. Oops, sorry. Laser pointer is what I wanted. Just some summary of what they are. One was I took the inspiration from the history contest and turned that into an article, Beyond the Sky, that which others saw from afar in the U.S. spaceflight program. Then after that, I did an article on the threat of near-Earth asteroids and comets to Earth. Following that, I did another article on the scientific revolution and the fight for freedom of thought. And then most recently, before this latest article, was Oasis in the Sky, the search for habitable worlds in the universe. So those were past articles in the Griffith Observer. And so now we'll get on to the basic start of our presentation. So we start off with intelligence on the Earth. And I'll start off with this quote by Russian school teacher Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, and it says, "Earth is the cradle of intelligence, but it is impossible to live forever in the cradle." So that's a key philosophy behind behind the space program and behind this idea of there being potentially life in the universe. And so here we start off with the picture of the Earth. Basically, Earth is traveling through space, as we all know. So we're in a spaceship, but Earth is protected from the ravages of space by the atmosphere. The atmosphere insulates all life on Earth from the dangerous space environment. So for example, I'm trying to go for the laser pointer. We are protected from dangerous radiation from the sun. We are protected from cosmic rays from deep space, micrometeoroids that are traveling throughout the solar system, large asteroids and comets, and of course the vacuum of space. Now prior to the 20th century, my claim is that no form of earthly life escaped into space on its own force, and that's a pretty good claim because we developed rocketry in the 20th century, and that's the first time anything left the atmosphere. So that was a pretty unique moment in time. Except for maybe microscopic life that may have ejected into space by asteroid or comet impacts. So those are the only potential sources of life from Earth that may be floating around elsewhere in the solar system. So We know that, of course, that we're all here. Intelligent life exists on Earth. I just mentioned the atmosphere. There's a special layer in the Earth's atmosphere that's about 46 to 621 miles in altitude, and it's called the ionosphere. Basically, it's a layer of air molecules that are ionized by solar and cosmic radiation. So using this layer, we can propagate radio waves. So we can propagate, commercial radio signals, cell phone signals, TV signals. All that is through the means of the ionosphere. The ionosphere can also allow some radiation transmissions to escape into space. So I mentioned earlier the 20th century. What was unique about that? Well, sometime in the 1930s, and that's where you saw this animation here showing an invisible expanding sphere traveling out from the Earth at the speed of light. Now imagine that sphere traveling, it's still traveling today. What is this spherical boundary? It's likely the first TV transmission that was powerful enough to escape into space. And as such, it was the first sign of intelligent life on the Earth. So this was dramatized in a 1997 movie by Carl Sagan named Contact. I don't know if some of you have seen that movie. And in this movie, radio astronomer Ellie Arroway, she's doing research listening for radio signals from extraterrestrials. And so she receives a signal from deep space, from the star Vega. So once her team looks at the signal, they discover that it contains pulses of the prime numbers, the first few prime numbers, a clear sign that it's artificial and not an actual signal. So also embedded in this signal is another transmission from Adolf Hitler, which announcing the opening ceremony of the 1936 Olympic Games in Germany. So that was a little bit of a shock in the movie, and that's what makes it dramatic. But in reality, despite the drama in the movie, this signal was at a high enough frequency excuse me, to escape the ionosphere, but it was very low power. And also it was omnidirectional, which means that the signal was spread pretty much in a sphere, and it went everywhere, which is why in the previous animation you saw the sphere expanding from the Earth. So given all those factors, it's unlikely that that signal is actually capable of being detected from anyone or anything that might be listening to signals from the Earth. So let's jump ahead now about 40 years to November 16th, 1974, where we sent a deliberate message to space, specifically the globular star cluster M13, which is in the constellation Hercules. And that's about 25,000 light years away. And if you need a reminder of what a light year is, it's about 6 trillion miles. So 25,000 times that. And this was sent from the Arecibo radio telescope, pictured here, to celebrate its upgrade at that time. And the message, and here's the globular cluster that's pictured. The message was, is shown graphically here, is kind of just, it covers a number of things. It covers the numbers 1 through 10 that we use. It covers the atomic numbers of the elements hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus. And all of these are elements are constituents of the DNA molecule that defines all life on Earth. And also in this message were the chemical formulae for the compounds that make up all of DNA's sugars and bases. The double helix structure of DNA was also shown, along with a graphic of the human form, in case they want to know what we generally look like. The average height of human, the human population of the Earth at that time, a map of the planets shown here in yellow, with the third one kind of, jutting up a little bit to show that that's where the signal came from, and a graphic of the transmitting antenna. So that was a more benign message sent a number of years later. And so now we'll transition to another segment of the presentation where I'll talk about who I call the theorist. And you've seen him before because he's Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the Russian school teacher. So in the 20th century, he was one of the early proponents of the theory of extraterrestrial life elsewhere in the universe. He was also happened to be one of the founding fathers of rocketry, the others being Hermann Oberth, the Romanian physicist, the French aviation expert Robert Esnol-Pelterie, and the American Robert Goddard, after which the Goddard Space Flight Center is named. So Tsiolkovsky, his mentor was a Russian philosopher named Nikolai Fedorov, and Fedorov held a philosophical view that all matter in the cosmos, be it from the tiniest grains of sand to the largest of stars, had some level of consciousness. Controversial idea, but humans, of course, would have the highest consciousness in his view. So inspired by this, later in his life, Tsiolkovsky wrote a number of essays about extraterrestrial life and intelligence throughout the universe. What was his argument and reasoning? Well, so his philosophy was one of monism, where all parts of the universe are basically one thing and subject to the same laws of physics. In panpsychism, he thought that consciousness exists in all things. And then he thought that the basic building blocks of the universe were all atoms. So, and then since life was possible on Earth, and given all these other factors, life must be present throughout the universe, and there must be intelligence around other stars and other planets. So that was his general reasoning. And in one of his essays, he went a little bit further. He was talking about life in the universe. He felt that some stars will have planets, and some of those planets will have the same composition as the Earth, and will be subject to the same physical laws. Therefore, some of these planets will have Earth-like environments. And so we know that life on Earth can exist in many types of environments, and so presumably life could exist in similar environments elsewhere in the universe. So that line of thinking is very similar to our current lines of thinking on this subject. So that makes him kind of a little bit ahead of his time, when he wrote these ideas. Oh, and I wanted to mention, I was mentioning extreme forms of life on Earth. Pictured here is a tardigrade. Some of you may have heard of this creature before. It can basically survive extreme conditions on the Earth. And it was recently even sent to the moon aboard the Israeli lunar lander that ended up crashing on the moon. So there are now these creatures somehow surviving up on the moon, probably dormant, but nonetheless, they're pretty hardy creatures. So moving on to spacefaring intelligences, well, it's one thing for life to be prevalent throughout the universe, but what about intelligence? So Tsiolkovsky thought that since taking humans as the example, humans basically are destined to travel into space. We're destined to live there. We're destined to colonize the solar system. That's his main premise. So in a similar manner, if you had other older civilizations that existed in the universe, they would have long ago expanded into their solar system. And so they would have expanded throughout the cosmos. And so this leads to a couple of conclusions. One of them is that assuming that intelligence does in fact populate throughout the universe, they must somehow know about the Earth. Earth is one of, a planet with intelligence. So they must know about us, and they must have visited the Earth in the past. That's one possible conclusion from this line of thinking. And if that's the case, then there must be some evidence of this to be found by science. So what are some counter-arguments? Tsiolkovsky thought of this and said, well, we haven't detected any evidence of these other civilizations scientifically. So why would that be? Some possible early clues, early answers, that is, one of them is Earth really has not truly been visited yet, but it will be at some point soon or in the near future, because other species have been visiting each other for quite a while. Another possibility is we don't currently have technology to actually detect the existence of other intelligences. That's another possibility. A third possibility is that maybe they are aware of us, but they know that humans are not mature enough to handle those kind of visits, given that we tend to harm other life at times. Or the fourth one is they're aware of us and they're purposely exempting the Earth from visitation, putting it inside a sort of a nature reserve, so that we can kind of mature a little bit more and advance. So those were some of his early thoughts on why we don't have evidence of other civilizations. So now we'll get to the paradox of the matter. So let's jump ahead to 1950 and go to Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. In there, at that time, we have a group of scientists, being one of them including Enrico Fermi, pictured here. They were having lunch. And so Los Alamos Lab is where the atomic bomb was developed in World War II as part of the Manhattan Project. So somehow the topic of discussion turned to unidentified flying objects. I don't know how serious they were, but at the time they were called flying saucers in the public and press. But they took it a little bit seriously and they asked the question, what is the probability that extraterrestrial life, if it exists, that they have advanced technology? And given that, what are the chances that these so-called flying saucers are in fact their crewed vehicles? That was their main question, two of their questions. So now we get to the paradox of the matter. So let's say life is widespread throughout the galaxy and that other planets are inhabited as we think. Then jump ahead to conclude that there may be many spacefaring civilizations out there. And this is kind of paralleling Konstantin Tsiolkovsky's views. Many of these worlds would have existed long before the Earth. And so given that, there should be evidence of visitation or even colonization of the Earth long ago. But clearly, we all know that there's lack of this evidence. And so given this, that presents a paradox. Basically, we think life should be prevalent and we think there should be intelligent life elsewhere, but yet we find no evidence so far of their existence. That's a little bit of a puzzle. Another form of this, in terms of robotics, say the other civilizations do exist, but they don't like space exploration, or they find it too costly or too dangerous. Well, in that case, they might want to send self-replicating robots. So like nowadays, we send robots throughout the solar system to explore, but their robotics may have advanced, would have advanced to the point where they're self-replicating. This idea was proposed by Hungarian physicist John von Neumann, pictured here. And the idea is that if this was possible, that you can create self-replicating machines, you could send these to different star systems, and they could then mine the raw materials of those star systems, asteroids, comets, planets, things of that sort, and use that material to self-replicate. So the Milky Way galaxy is about 13.5 billion years old. And so say there was even just one civilization that was born at the beginning of our galaxy's birth. Well then, if they have self-replicating robots, they would have long ago sent those out to the galaxy, and they would have filled the galaxy, and surely we would have found them in our own solar system. So the lack of evidence of this so far is another form of Fermi's paradox in terms of robotics. So So we've talked about the paradox now. Now, what are some, we talked a little bit about Tsiolkovsky's reasoning as to why we have not been visited or why there's no evidence. Some solutions that have recently been proposed we're going to go over those next. So in 2003, physicist Stephen Webb of Open University in England published 50 possible solutions to the Fermi Paradox. So broadly, they fall into 3 categories. The first is humans are in fact alone in the universe. That's one option we can't just dismiss. Second option is other intelligences exist, but they're not communicating with the Earth, which is why we haven't heard anything from them or about them. And the third one is, well, maybe they have somehow visited the Earth or somehow reached the Earth. It seems a strange conclusion despite the lack of evidence, but let's consider that as well. So let's look at the first category. We are alone, or at least very rare. So some options for this category include, well, maybe the universe really was made entirely for humans, and we are truly the only ones. Another option is human beings may be the first intelligence to arise in the galaxy. So we're the first and only ones in the club in our galaxy. So that's why we haven't heard from anybody else. The third option is the Earth, all life on it, humans, and our solar system in general, pretty rare combination, pretty rare system in the grand scheme of things in the galaxy and in the universe. And the fourth option is that maybe there is life prevalent throughout the universe, but they just don't have spacefaring technology. And so that's why we never have heard of them. So those are all under the category of we are alone or rare. Second category that we discussed is alien communication is impossible or somehow limited. So options for this include several. One is interstellar is infeasible because the distance between stars is just too vast. That's something that we don't have interstellar travel even despite our space age technology. Is it possible? Some would like to think yes, but maybe there's a limit to that. Colonization of space occurs maybe in clusters, and we're just kind of in a void that's ignored. And so maybe other parts of the galaxy have been colonized or visited. Third option is these other civilizations may only send robots to explore space, as the self-replicating robots idea I mentioned a few minutes ago, instead of crewed vehicles. So they're not sending their people out into space, they're just sending their robots. The fourth option is advanced intelligences are in fact communicating with the Earth, but they're using some technology that we have not discovered or we don't have as yet. The fifth option is they are communicating with us in radio waves, but at a frequency we have not looked at yet. So the sixth option is, well, we've barely started to listen. I give an analogy of one of the SETI founders, SETI pioneers. Her name is Jill Tarter, and she gave an analogy where she said, we've barely started listening. It's like thinking of the whole universe as an ocean, and we've only begun looking at a cup of glass of the water. So we've barely started searching. And so maybe that's why we haven't heard or learned of anything. The last option is a little pessimistic, but it says that maybe other civilizations don't last very long. Maybe they self-destroy for some unknown reason, or maybe some known reason. So the third option is other life has reached Earth, has reached or knows of the Earth. So some options for this category include, well, this is the giggle one. Maybe they are visiting Earth, but this information is being hidden from us. That's what a lot of the conspiracy theorists would have us believe. The second option is, well, they did visit Earth, they know of Earth, but it was such a long time ago, they've since left, and the evidence is long gone. The third is the zoo hypothesis, which I kind of alluded to a little bit earlier. They know of Earth, they're observing us from afar, and they've set us aside as a nature reserve. You know, maybe we don't like to think of ourselves as being part of a nature reserve, but it's certainly a possibility. Fourth option is the whole universe is actually a simulation developed by an advanced intelligent civilization. Some scientists have actually proposed or postulated this idea, and some of them are not fans of it. I know that Elon Musk, the rocket engineer, is a fan of this idea, but there's really no way where we can really know if that's the case, as far as I know. The fifth option is life ultimately originated off the Earth, somewhere else in the universe or galaxy, and it was actually purposely seeded on this planet, something which is called directed panspermia theory, instead of the opposite theory, which is undirected panspermia, where life is just randomly seeded by impacts from comets or asteroids. So now let's move on to the search. So we've talked about the paradox. We talked about the ideas behind why some people think there may be life and intelligence in the universe. But what do we have to say about it scientifically? What have we looked at so far? So the original idea to search in the modern time started in 1959 with a foundational paper by MIT physicist Philip Morrison and Giuseppe Cocconi. They published a paper in the journal Nature. And the proposal was that they could use the newly developed radio telescopes to search the sky for microwave signals for other signs of intelligence. Their reasoning, well, microwave beams are a feasible form of communication between stars in the galaxy, since at that microwave range of frequencies would not be absorbed by interstellar dust clouds that exist throughout the galaxy. So that was their reasoning. And around the same time, there was a young astronomer named Frank Drake who thought of a novel experiment for a newly built radio telescope, which is the one shown here, an 85-foot diameter dish in Greenback, West Virginia. So he developed some calculations that showed that this radio telescope could detect a signal that was transmitted towards the Earth from a similarly sized radio telescope from a planet up to 12 light years away. So he pitched this idea to his supervisors, and they agreed to allocate him some time. And so in the spring of 1960, Drake aimed the dish at two nearby stars over a span of 2 months. So the campaign was called Project Ozma in honor of the fictional story about the Land of Oz. But of course, he detected nothing but static. But it was important because historically, it's the first time that anyone attempted to listen for signs of extraterrestrial intelligence, which is currently known as SETI. So NASA involvement. Let's jump ahead 10 years. NASA funded a study called Project Cyclops, where they wanted to do a dedicated SETI effort. And they envisioned an array of 1,500 large radio telescopes spanning an area of about 10 miles. But the estimated cost of this, about $10 billion at the time. And so because of that, the project was canceled. It's just too expensive. But a few years later, NASA proposed a new SETI program under Philip Morrison, who originally proposed the search idea. And so the project started, but it had funding issues in 1978 when a senator from Wisconsin gave it a Golden Fleece Award, which was a sign in his mind of a waste of taxpayer money. So he proposed an amendment in 1981 to a NASA funding bill where he wanted to defund SETI. And so the astronomer Carl Sagan, who I mentioned earlier, learned of this, met with Proxmire, and convinced him that he shouldn't go with this proposal, and that SETI was actually worth the effort. Also, as SETI was having struggles within NASA, other organizations started their own SETI efforts. One of them was the Planetary Society, who some of you may be members of, and it was founded in part by Carl Sagan. It started off funding a program called Suitcase SETI, which was a system that could basically fit in a suitcase. It could analyze several 131,000 narrow channels. It later morphed into an official program named Project Sentinel, and that got further advancements in terms of the number of frequency channels it could scan. So the technology continued to improve to the present day. University of California, Berkeley also has its own program currently called Serendip, the search for extraterrestrial radio emissions from nearby developed intelligent populations, which was started in 1979 and still ongoing. They wanted to use one of the 90-meter dishes in West Virginia for this purpose. And also the Arecibo radio telescope, which I had mentioned earlier at the beginning of the presentation. So far, about 400 or so signals have been found that are interesting, but there's not enough data to determine where they're coming from or their origin. Are they terrestrial or what? Ohio State University began its own SETI program in 1973 using its Big Air radio telescope, shown here in this field. And they actually found an interesting signal, which was called the WOW signal. So in 1977, on August 15th, one of their astronomers, Jerry Amen, pointed the telescope near the globular cluster M55, which is in the constellation Sagittarius. So he detected a sudden jump in radio waves. It lasted for about 72 seconds, but then he never heard from it again. So in the data printout, he saw the signal and even wrote "wow" in the margins to indicate his surprise at it. But this signal has kind of been in people's minds since then. Is it a real signal or is it not? But in 2017, some researchers proposed an idea that there were two comets in that same location at that time, and that their hydrogen clouds produced natural radio signals, and that's what he detected. But this has been questioned with additional research. So we still don't know what that was. So NASA is still trying to be involved here. In 1988, they proposed another effort at SETI. In 1990, the George H.W. Bush administration proposed a SETI program named the Microwave Observing Project, or MOP, not the greatest name. So they later renamed it to HRMS, which stands for the High Resolution Microwave Survey. And so they had two main components to this. One using the Arecibo radio telescope that I mentioned earlier for targeted search. And then another using NASA's Deep Space Network for an all-sky survey. And the Deep Space Network, one of the antennas is shown here in Goldstone, California. Of course, these are the antennas that receive all the data and send commands to all the spacecraft that NASA has exploring the solar system. But their SETI program was short-lived because, again, a member of Congress was not for this. So Senator Richard Bryan of Nevada proposed an amendment that effectively killed NASA's SETI effort. And the full Congress agreed. And so since then, at least to my knowledge, there are no other NASA SETI projects currently underway. So once SETI was canceled, several of the scientists that were involved joined a nonprofit group called the SETI Institute, which some of you may have heard of, that was formed in 1984. So this group got a boost in about 2003 when one of Microsoft's co-founders, Paul Allen, donated about $25 million to their institute to build the Allen Telescope Array in Northern California. And that one of the telescopes is shown pictured here. They envisioned originally about 350 of these telescopes, but by 2007 only about 42 or so were completed. And they temporarily shut down in about 2011 due to funding shortfalls, but I believe they're still continuing their efforts. But there's still life to SETI because in 2015, a new program was announced called Breakthrough Initiatives. And this was announced by Russian billionaire Yuri Milner and the physicist Stephen Hawking. So their effort, which they have several programs, but one of them is called Breakthrough Listen. they envision spending about $100 million over 10 years to conduct a search of artificial radio signals and optical signals, optical laser signals, that is. So what do they want to do? Well, they want to search the Milky Way galaxy, both the plane of the Milky Way galaxy, where all the spiral arms are, and as well as the center of the galaxy, as well as the 100 nearest galaxies to the Earth. And so the plan is they want to use, as far as telescopes for the radio search, they'd like to use the 100-meter telescope in Green Bank, West Virginia for the search, and the 64-meter Parkes telescope in Australia for this reason as well. And they want to use the automated Planet Finder telescope at the Observatory for the optical search. So there's still life ongoing with the SETI effort in that sense. But NASA's apparently still not done quite as yet, because as recently as last fall, they held a workshop where they looked at what are some ways to detect extraterrestrial technologies, or what they call technosignatures. So what are some possible technosignatures? Well, there are traditional radio transmissions, of course. That's what everyone's been searching for. Then there's optical laser searches. Maybe other civilizations are using optical lasers for communications, or even for propulsion, certain types of exotic propulsion. We can look at exoplanets and study their atmospheres and search for greenhouse gases that might be produced by other civilizations, just as they are produced on Earth. We can look for structures around other stars, megastructures such as a Dyson sphere, which is an example of which is pictured here. And the Dyson sphere is, if you haven't heard of one before, it's basically a large structure that's envisioned to be built around a star to capture the solar radiation and use the energy for whatever purposes they might see fit. And so if those really exist, the idea is that we could use some of our optical telescopes to look for excess infrared heat from these large spacecraft with solar panels. And also, if the structure is large enough, as you can see in this picture, it could block out some of the light of the star. And if that's the case, then we can detect that dip in the star's light from the Earth with our telescopes. And actually, one of NASA's telescopes, the Kepler Space Telescope, was studying. It's no longer operating, but found an interesting star as one of its results, and it was popularly called Tabby Star, after one of the astronomers that was studying it. And one of the suggestions they saw the star's light dip about 22%, which is a surprising result. So another astronomer, I believe, conceived of a possibility that maybe this was an extraterrestrial structure that was blocking out the light of the star. But nowadays, I think they believe it's mostly just dust. So it's not really an exotic explanation. And then the last thing NASA wanted to consider was back to the robotic probes from other civilizations. Maybe they are within our solar system, but maybe they're dormant, maybe they're transmitting, but maybe they've landed. We just haven't studied enough. We haven't looked. So those are some of the technosignatures NASA is considering. Now we move on to the next part of the presentation, which is about a famous equation. So we talked about the search. Now we'll talk about an equation known as the Drake equation. So I mentioned Frank Drake before. He was the astronomer who started Project Ozma. So in November 1961, shortly after that first SETI attempt, the National Academy of Sciences held a small conference on SETI. And just prior to the conference, Drake envisioned an equation, devised an equation to estimate n, which is the number of civilizations that we might contact within our galaxy. It's known, the equation is named after him, the Drake equation, and it has 7 terms in it. At best, this equation gives us an upper limit on n, the number of civilizations. At worst, it quantifies some of our ignorance. There are some terms that we just don't know very well. So a brief explanation of some of these terms. R, the first term, is the average number of stars formed in the galaxy per year. I believe this is on the order of 1 star per year or so for the Milky Way galaxy. FP represents a fraction of stars in the galaxy that form planets. Through the Kepler Space Telescope, we know that other stars do in fact have planets. Through different techniques, we've found that. About 4,000 planets have been found so far. And so extrapolating from that, there are literally billions of planets in the galaxy. And so the fraction of those that form planets, stars that form planets, I think, if I remember correctly, is maybe on the order of about a fifth. NE is the number of planets per star system that are planets suitable for life, which means that the planet exists in the star's habitable zone. And the habitable zone, if you're not familiar with that term, is the region around the star where liquid water can exist on the surface. And of course, the Earth exists in the sun's habitable zone, which is why liquid water can exist on the Earth. But that's, NE is kind of a guess at this point. FL is a fraction of habitable planets where life develops. Well, that's a guess as well. F sub I represents a fraction of habitable planets where intelligence actually develops. That's another guess. And FC represents a fraction of intelligent civilizations with advanced technology. Another guess as well. And finally, L represents the average lifetime of such civilizations. So how do we use this equation to determine what the value of n should be? Well, at this 1961 meeting, the experts in attendance provided an estimate of all the terms in the trig equation. And some of the terms canceled to 1. They concluded that n was roughly equal to L. So n is pretty much dependent on the lifetime of civilizations. And so this caused the physics professor, Philip Morrison, to be a little pessimistic about this, because he thought, well, humans developed the atomic bomb and rocketry and radio communications all around the same time. So while we might become spacefaring, we might also destroy ourselves with some of our technology. And so if other life out there might have done the same, they might be limited in the same way. So he was a little pessimistic about that. The astronomer Carl Sagan, who was in attendance, of course, thought that he was a little more optimistic. He thought that some civilizations might actually, surpass the development of weapons of mass destruction, and they might actually expand into their star systems and extend their civilization's lifetime, millions, billions of years. So he thought that prospects were better than not, that they would still survive. So the SETI meeting, they estimated n to be anywhere between 1,000 to 100 million civilizations in our galaxy. That's a wide range, and there are at least 100 billion stars in our galaxy alone, up to maybe 400 billion stars in our galaxy. So plenty of stars out there. But what if there were only 1,000 civilizations in the galaxy? Well, that would be 1 out of every 100 million stars. At the lower bound, with 1 out of every 100 million stars, the chance of detecting a civilization would be pretty small. There's just not that many, and the chance of success would be low. At the upper bound, 1 civilization out of every 1,000 stars, well then, just search 1,000 stars, find 1 civilization, search another 1,000 stars, find another civilization. Chances are better in that case. But even in the worst case, say there's only 1 advanced civilization per galaxy, well, there are trillions of galaxies in the universe. So in reality, there could be trillions of these civilizations out there. So now we'll move on to the last part of the presentation, which is what I call the flatline. So what about the inverse problem? what about detecting signs of Earth intelligence from space? Is that something that's possible? So that's the inverse idea. This was actually tried in December 1990 by the Galileo spacecraft, which was launched by NASA on its way to Jupiter, had a gravity assist of the Earth. And this picture shown here is from its, not that flyby, but a second gravity assist of the Earth by Galileo in 1992, where it shows the Earth and the Moon. And so the idea is, well, can another spacecraft, whether it's flying past the Earth or maybe even studying from afar, whether it's terrestrial or not, ours or not, can it detect signs of life on Earth? This idea was promoted by the astronomer Carl Sagan. So Galileo did this experiment, turned its instruments to Earth, and it has an instrument called the Near Infrared Mapping Spectrometer. Spectrometer is an instrument that can study the light coming from a planet or source and determine the composition of the object. And so it turned this instrument to the Earth and detected, of course, molecular oxygen in our atmosphere at 19% by mass, which is close to the known abundance of 21%. So what could account for such a large abundance of oxygen? Well, are there any non-biological processes that can produce this oxygen? Well, there's lots of water in the atmosphere, and UV light from the sun can split this water into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen will escape to space, but leaving behind the oxygen, but this by itself can't account for the amount of oxygen we find in our atmosphere. What about biology? Well, turns out that half of the Earth's oxygen is actually produced by ocean phytoplankton using photosynthesis, and the other half, of course, by land plants. So we know on Earth that oxygen is produced mostly by plant life. And what about, Galileo also detected methane in our atmosphere. This is pretty interesting because methane in a high oxygen atmosphere will react to form carbon dioxide and water. And so it should, given this reaction, methane should quickly just disappear. But we find it in our atmosphere. And so a scientist from another society looking at this, would conclude, well, something must be replenishing the methane on the Earth's atmosphere, in the Earth's atmosphere. And so we know that about half of the observed methane in the atmosphere is coming from biology, from methane bacteria. The other half is from human activity. So if observing methane in an oxygen-rich atmosphere on an exoplanet, for example, we would be strongly suggestive that there might be biology in that exoplanet. So Galileo also looked at this observed nitrous oxide, N2O, and spectral signs of chlorophyll with its imaging cameras. Nitrous oxide, of course, will last no more than about 50 years before it breaks down naturally, just using photodissociation or just via sunlight. But we know that nitrogen-fixing bacteria and algae produce most of Earth's nitrous oxide. So similarly as with methane, is produced by biology on the Earth. Chlorophyll, of course, we all know is a pigment in plant cells, and it's part of a plant's photosynthetic system. So, as I mentioned earlier, all plant life on Earth produces most of the oxygen in the atmosphere. And actually, Earth didn't always have oxygen before oxygen-producing life existed. The atmosphere was a little bit different on the Earth. So that would be a definite indication of potential life if we found it on another exoplanet. Now, we've looked at, Galileo found signs of biology on the Earth, but what about signs of intelligence? Well, of course, humans are the only beings on the Earth with intelligent beings with advanced technology. So we can generate TV signals, we can generate radio signals, we can generate radar transmissions, etc. All of these can be detected from space. Galileo had an instrument called a plasma wave spectrometer instrument that looked at the detected radio waves escaping from the Earth's night side ionosphere. And so the universe has many sources of radio waves. Some of them are natural, So how would you distinguish artificial radio waves from natural radio waves? Well, Galileo, in terms of Galileo's signal, there were two signs of artificiality. The radio signal was concentrated in a few frequency channels and that were nearly constant. That is, they didn't drift, the frequencies didn't drift on the scale of a few hours. Whereas natural radio signals tend to drift. Also there was the presence of a pulse-like amplitude modulation pattern suggesting that there's information in the radio signal. And pictured here is the Galileo spacecraft relative to humans. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I have here the day of that discovery, and what I'm referring to is the day when we actually find that there's life elsewhere in the universe, be it microscopic or maybe even a signal from another civilization. That's going to be a pretty big day in history because it's going to answer the question, are we alone? It's going to answer Fermi's Paradox. Life will continue as usual, of course. You know, people still go to the grocery store and all that stuff. But I don't think society will be the same after that point. And so I leave you finally with this quote by Carl Sagan. It says, "The universe is a pretty big place. If it's just us, seems like an awful waste of space." So if you want to see that, watch the movie Contact. And that's it. Thank you very much. So now I'll take any questions you may have. Yes.
I have a historical note. In 1973, I was at a small conference which had Carl as well. And I was talking about very high power lasers. And he became very interested in using a laser to direct a beam at nearby possible targets. Mm-hmm. And Albert Hibbs, who you may know, he was from a JPL and was a very important popularizer. He objected. He said, whenever on Earth two civilizations of different technological levels met, the weaker one always got wiped out. And so we really haven't tried sending signals out. Mm-hmm. And one other comment. The way I understood Fermi's question was, where is everybody?
Yes.
And part of the answer is, when have you visited a nearby ant's nest, right? You don't pay attention to it.
Right.
If you do, it's bad for them.
Right. Well, with the ant's nest analogy, I would say people do study ant's nests, biologists, but their interest is scientific. They're not necessarily trying to learn anything from the ants to better their technologies. But they typically leave the ants alone, but maybe some people don't care about the ants. And like you said, you know, the more advanced civilization could wipe out the anthill, for example. So that is a question that some scientists ask, which is your question about the anthill. Should we try to contact anybody if they're actually out there? Is that a good idea, or is that a bad idea? Will we reach somebody or some civilization and be able to share knowledge and grow, advance our technologies, or will we find another society that's very belligerent and prone to attacking or prone to wiping out any other society they find? So that is a question, the ethical question that some scientists do ask. And there's a book which I recently heard of, a science fiction book by a Chinese author where he, I think it's called the three-body problem, where he postulates this idea of, you know, civilizations coming into contact. So I haven't read the book yet, but I'll probably try to do that to kind of learn what he thinks of that scenario. Any other questions?
So Senator Protzmeyer died a while ago. Let's say we wanted to increase the federal funding by a factor of 10. Where should we put the money?
The funding for, the question is where should we put federal funding, I assume for NASA, to address the SETI, the Fermi Paradox and life elsewhere in the universe? That's a good question. Well, NASA's portfolio is pretty broad. They do human space flight, they do space science, they do astronomy, they do astrophysics. So I think there's room within their budget personally for this type of search. I don't know if they want to spend $10 billion on a giant array of radio telescopes for that purpose. But I'm not sure how much of their NASA's resources should go to this effort. But NASA is putting money into searching for exoplanets, like the Kepler Space Telescope, which launched in 2009 and recently stopped operating. They also launched another telescope called TESS, a Transiting Exoplanet Satellite, which will look for exoplanets as well. We also have the James Webb Space Telescope, which is going to be launched, I believe, in a couple of years. And it will have the capability to study atmospheres of exoplanets. So as far as exoplanet science is concerned, the money is definitely being put there. As far as radio signal searches or optical signal searches, I think it would be a great thing for NASA to devote some funds to that. But I think there's always maybe going to be an element of society or Congress that thinks that it's not a greatest use of funds. I guess you could argue that human spaceflight, or NASA in general, for some of those folks, would not be a good use of funds. There are plenty of problems on the Earth, so to speak, so why spend it on space? So there's that line of thinking. But I think that, of course, we've all seen benefits from the space program in terms of technology and what we learn about the planet. And I think the big questions are important to answer. Are we alone? What's our place in the universe? Those are pretty big questions that we've been asking from the dawn of time. So I think that's quite worth the money that would be spent on it. Just a question of how much.
I understand the complexity of the universe. It really amazes me. I read an article one time, and I know the scientists use the frequency spectrums to measure distance and so forth. How have they determined that the universe is 13.8 billion years old and get down to not only the minute or seconds, they break the second down into planktons.
Right.
How have they determined what kind of readings other than how they only discovered what 300 or 400 galaxies, but yet they know almost to the instant of the Big Bang Theory. What do they use?
So the question is, how do scientists determine the age of the universe and how with such precision? So my training is in astronautical engineering, so I'm not astrophysicist per se, but I have studied the subject somewhat. I believe that they study to determine distances, for example, in space, they look at Cepheid variable stars, which vary in brightness, and so they can, using that brightness, they can tell how far away stars are. They also look at they know that the universe is expanding, and I believe they're looking at the Hubble constant, which is a constant that affects the acceleration of the universe. They can rewind that back in time and conclude that the universe is about 13 billion years old or so. I did recently read an article that the age of the universe may be a little bit uncertain. And so it may be, I don't know if I remember this number correctly, 1 billion years younger or older. That's the kind of the error in the measurements of the Hubble constant using different techniques. And as far as getting down to precision of the Big Bang, I think the theories of the formation of the universe Well, first we know that the Big Bang occurred because you can, when you study the microwave sky, we see this temperature throughout the sky of about 3 Kelvin, which is just 3 degrees above absolute zero, throughout the whole sky. And so that's actually the afterglow of the Big Bang. So, rewind back in time and it gets much hotter. Rewind back in time, the universe gets smaller and smaller and smaller till it gets to a small point, which was the Big Bang. And I think the theories of physics, they have models of the universe where they can, put in the constants and put in the numbers and predict. It's basically predicting, the temperature of the universe, for example, or the size of the universe at a fraction of a second after the Big Bang occurred. They use those predictions to verify what they observe with some of our space telescopes. So they predict and then they verify with observations, which is typically how science operates. So, and it's pretty amazing, I think, that we can predict these things and verify them through observations. So it's a testament to our intelligence.
There are a lot of popular books which explain the whole chain of physical observations and theories that allow them to come to these conclusions. I can give you the name if you want.
So the comment was about a lot of popular science books that kind of give you the history of the whole universe. Let's see, I can think of a couple examples. Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time is a famous one. Neil deGrasse Tyson has a book called Origins, which talks about the origins of the universe. Hubble Deep Field. Yeah, they pointed the Hubble telescope at a patch of sky which looked empty, and they were even questioning whether it was even a good use of resources because there's nothing there to the visible eye. And when it came back, all full of galaxies. So extrapolate that, and.
What were you saying about what happened in the 30s with the Hitler
Transmission?
The transmission. So what happened? It went out?
Well, so that was, the transmission was real from the Olympic Games, and it was just it's fictionalized in Carl Sagan's Contact.
That was okay.
That the signal came back. And it was including that, yeah.
Much less advanced than then. We wouldn't be a danger.
We wouldn't necessarily be a threat. So I can see that argument. Yeah. We'd be like ants, in a sense. Yeah. So I can see that as well. So I mean. So
it's all speculation, but I would be more optimistic than fearful of it.
Right.
Given my thinking.
Yeah, that's good. I don't think we should necessarily fear. I personally believe in searching, continuing the search. Let's see what's out there. Let's find out if there are other planets with life. We shouldn't necessarily be afraid of the knowledge, but I'm sure there are segments of society that, if once it happens, they might question.
Yeah, for sure. So, anyhow, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you ever look into quantum physics?
Me personally? Quantum physics for just interest, or as far as
like searching the universe, have like JPL or NASA looked into the quantum physics?
I know that JPL worked on a project called the Cold Atom Lab, which they installed on the International Space Station, and I'm not sure. I think if I remember correctly, it's the coldest lab in the universe, but it's operating in space. They compacted it and put it on the space station. I'm not sure exactly what they're trying to study. Maybe the properties of quantum level of atoms. It might be what they're trying to study. So that is something that I think some of NASA is looking into.
Okay. How are we able to watch this when we just had in this club? What is the website to be able to watch it?
I think as Randy said, you just have to go to YouTube, search for Laguna Woods Astronomy Club.
Oh.
There are a few other videos there as well.
Okay.
And so this will appear at some point soon, I'm not sure.
Right. It's just that I believe in Jesus, and I believe that He did walk on the water. There's a lady that wrote a book. The last name is Capps. Anyways, Charles Capps' daughter, and she did a small book about the quantum physics.
Oh, I
So I
see.
mean, you're like in a field that you just go with a wide open mind.
True.
You can discover, you know, like it's endless. I just do believe that the Lord did walk on the water. So, and it's so like interesting that whenever these spaceships are going out, they don't want any dust on them.
For planetary protection.
Yeah.
That's the reason. I guess the idea with NASA is if you send something to Mars and thinking, does Mars have any native life of its own presently or in the past? You don't want to mistakenly send Earth life there. And then we think we found life on Mars, and it turned out to be identical to life on the Earth. So there's that caution with NASA.
Oh, so that to keep it so pure.
Right. But then there's also Elon Musk wants to start colonizing Mars, and he's serious about it. He's developing a spaceship to send people there. And there's a question in some people's minds is that a good thing to do? Because then we're sending people, and people have microbes all over. How do you protect Mars from the Earth's microbes? But then again, say, well, maybe life originated on Mars, and so it's not all that different from Earth. And so maybe we're just putting back what Mars sent to us. That's kind of a controversial theory. But yeah, that's planetary protection is something that's definitely considered.
Yeah, because we went to the Goldstone and we gone on different trips through the club.
Okay.
And they just stress that so much. This cannot have any dust.
Right.
Not even a speck. It's like
Yeah. Well, there's dust. There's just the claim that there's spacecraft, and there's also like spores or microbes. I think the cleanliness, I'm not too sure, but it must be protected electronics. You don't want things charging in space and damaging the electronics.
And then that spaceship that crashed, the Israeli spaceship that crashed.
Yes.
Do they know why? So many factors, maybe many.
From what I understand, I thought there was a problem with one of the sensors on board, the sensors that determine the attitude of the spacecraft. So it tells us how it's tilted relative to the ground. Something must have gone wrong with that. So that's why it ended up crashing. And then there was a recent Indian lunar lander. I don't know if you've heard of that one. That they tried to land a couple weeks ago, last week, September 6th, I think. That ended up crashing as well. But at the very last, well, we don't know if it crashed. They said it's on the surface. They actually said it's on the surface. They have pictures of it. We haven't seen the pictures yet. But they can't communicate with it.
Well, thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you.
Wow. I could listen to you guys all day long. So interesting. I was wondering, about the Egyptians, the Indian culture, the American Indian culture, Mexico, how advanced they were all. And there's a lot of talk that there's aliens. But I'm American Indian myself. And in our culture, we have religion, like a lot of other civilizations. Our religion says we came from outer space and came to the galaxy and landed here in the center of the earth, and that the animals have taught us to get to the surface. Have you ever heard stories like that?
I think I've heard of Native Americans and at least Native American. I'm not sure about other cultures.
Yeah.
That believe that we're from the stars.
Yeah.
So I think culturally, that's an important thing to consider in the whole story of astronomy. And I mean, people would see the stars in the sky and wonder about them. We have science now to tell us what's happening with them physically.
Yeah, because we had scopes and all that kind of stuff and different ways of reading the the atmosphere, the skies, and stars, and all that good stuff. So I'm just really curious because I grew up with the religion that we came from outer space and came through the galaxy and landed here. So I'm just...
It's interesting parallel to some of the things that I mentioned.
And that's how our civilization got developed here, from that intelligence. That's a lot of our beliefs. Yeah, but I don't know because...
What tribe are you?
I'm Yaqui.
Yaqui tribe.
Tucson.
Tucson, okay.
And my tribe goes all the way into Mexico. That's the Yaqui from Sonora.
Okay.
Yeah. But my dad was the last one born on the reservation in Arizona. I'm the first American.
Oh, I see.
By the way America talks to us. If you're not born in the USA, out of the reservation, you're not American. So I'm the first American.
Okay.
My dad was reservation born. So, but I grew up all Indian, and that's the only things that I know. So it kind of fascinates me, all this. And I'm just like everybody else, kind of inquisitive about how the pyramids got built. And the communication wasn't there yet. We got the Egyptians, and then we got the Aztec, we got India, because I travel a lot. And it just blows me away every time I see them.
Right.
So I make connection.
Right.
Yeah, so do you take stories like that and history and cultures and kind of put it into all this that's maybe possible?
I think the scientific explanation is, I know that some people nowadays think that to build the pyramids, for example, they needed help from other beings, for example. But I think the modern scientific explanation is that we don't have any evidence of that. Again, it goes back to the Fermi Paradox of, we don't have any evidence of these visitations, if they really did happen.
But how do you explain all the modern buildings and the cuttings and the weights and how everything?
I'm not an Egyptologist, so I don't know too much about
India,
that.
Egypt, Mexico. They all have,
or even the other,
even China.
Yeah, even the other civilizations. I don't know. I'm inclined to think that humans are just capable beings, and even though we have science nowadays, we were advanced in some ways back in those days too.
Yeah, with no schooling too. That amazes me too. How did they get that intelligence all together?
I think intelligence, bodies of knowledge get built up, throughout time, and that's how you pass along the knowledge to generations. We're basically standing on the shoulders of the previous people that came before us.
But you take that into consideration, or they really don't kind of mix them? I'm just kind of wondering.
You could take in consideration
they're like my religion, our religion, Indian culture, religion versus science and physics and all that good stuff. They don't look at it. It's just two separate things.
I don't think they consider it within the realm of science, for the most part. It is important culturally to understand how different societies view the heavens and view the sky. So I think from that perspective, it's important, to be aware of that for history purposes. But yeah, I don't think that, as of right now at least, we haven't, I don't believe any scientists conclude that, the pyramids were helped by other beings or anything like that, so.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
I came to the last couple of meetings we had here, but I really like that subject a lot.
This subject?
Mike, I had a question for you.
Yes.
On one of your slides, you said that if there was only one intelligent civilization per galaxy, there'd be how many?
So I said one civilization per galaxy. There would be trillions of civilizations because there are trillions of galaxies, up to 1 trillion galaxies. Is the latest estimate.
I heard was 400 billion. It
400
used to
billion.
be 200 billion.
Right. It keeps on growing. So there might be more space out there that we can't see. Say again?
I just kind of wonder how you come with those calculations. It's like, I don't know.
You do optical counts of a little area, and you find that area then
represents
much bigger.
Right. Just looking at a little area and then said, well, this must be the case across the whole sky. And that's how they come up with the numbers.
Yeah. I heard there was
There was a program called Mars 1, I believe, a Dutch project but I don't think it's gone further. They were trying to recruiting people to be astronauts for a one-way trip to Mars. But I think they run into money problems.
Oh, he would have buy a ticket to go to the moon or Mars or somewhere. I think somebody said it was 200,000, but I don't know.
200,000 is on Virgin Galactic. They're just a suborbital space flight, but you get to see the Earth from space and experience weightlessness, and
Wow.
I think they're near ready to operate.
Wow.
So
That's amazing.
if you have some money saved up and you want to spend it on that,
Be a drop in the bucket for some.
yeah.
On the other hand, it's not enough for others.
Yep. Maybe the
There's up there, not looking for it. That's why we can't remember. The need I say, our brains are deteriorating. No, they just get